Welcome to Off Hours, a conversation between John Edwards and Chris Manning.
Quick bit of follow-up from last episode. Between when that episode was recorded and now, I attended a conference here in the capital called Canucks, and one of the presenters at Canucks was Kevin Deavy, who runs a firm locally here in Ottawa, a design shop. And he was one of the principal designers on a piece of technology for automated manufacturing made by another local company here in Ottawa known as Raven Telemetry. And they make or specialize in a suite of products that essentially guard against downtime on automated machines. So in a manufacturing environment, it is keeping tabs on the production rates, whether you're falling behind targets, on target, whether running low on stock, all these sorts of things. So I thought that was kind of neat that popped up, given what we had talked about briefly about CNC machines. You're effectively losing money as a business when they're not running. So you want to have them running all the time if possible and as optimally as possible in order for the business to be most productive.
Yeah, this kind of work is important, and it's interesting to see how it's expanded. In a previous life, when I was doing IT work, one of the products that I worked on was geared towards inventory management for large distributors of various things. In this case, most of them were electrical and plumbing suppliers, and the software would help figure out how much of any product it needed. The company needed on hand at any time, and was able to proactively order and things like that based on what was needed, and also kept track of what was actually on hand and whether you needed more of it and things like that. So this is just a sort of an extension of that kind of work, where it's sort of functioning in the manufacturing world, where it's a little bit different than just distribution, where you can just magically order stuff. In the case of manufacturing, of course, you can't just magically order stuff. You have to actually make the thing. So this is interesting to see the what people are doing, because of course this sort of ties in the computer world with the physical world and what's happening on a machining center. So this is a interesting piece of kit. I didn't realize that this was being developed here in the capital.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and similar to the auto crib we mentioned for inventory control at Lee Valley, and the way that helped keep things organized and flowing and boosted uptime and production. That Raven Sense, which is the product that Raven creates that pairs with these CNC machines, boasts 15% increases in uptime for companies. And that may not sound like much, but if you're making 100 widgets an hour, that's 15 extra widgets every hour. And that
adds up quickly.
That adds up over time. Mm-hmm. So what on earth was everybody sending you that you felt compelled to ask everyone to stop sending it to you on Twitter?
There's a few people out there who send me interesting things on a regular basis. You do, and Rich does, and so I'm always getting good links to things from the two of you. But for whatever reason, this week, everybody that I know, people who never send me things, decided to send me this particular link, and it's odd because this is for a pen that Richard Mill created, the RMS 5 pen that they created, and it was released sometime in 2016. So this is the reason why I was a little bit confused and frustrated today or this week, because I saw this pen watch. It's got a watch component in it that allows the pen mechanism to retract and extend. This thing is 2 years old. Of course, I saw it when it came out because everybody in the pen world was talking about it at the time. And for whatever reason, it hit the zeitgeist this week, and everybody who knows that I make pens and that I'm starting to get into watches decided that this was the thing to show me. And of course, it's interesting when it comes up once or twice, but when people who never send you links ever all of a sudden are sending you this, and it's 7 or 8 people who are sending it to you, you're like, yes, thank you, I've seen this. Anyways, it's an interesting pen. It's a little bit beyond most people's price range, I think. That's fair to say.
I'd say so. A 6-figure pen is
Yeah.
in the realm of the preposterous.
Yeah, even for someone like myself who has 5-figure pens, that's a little bit crazy. So, anyways, we'll put a link in the show notes to this pen so you can see it in action. It is a fascinating mechanism. I would love to get my hands on one and tear it apart and see what he's doing. But at $105,000, I'm not going to be buying one of these pens anytime soon. And if I do, I am not going to be tearing it apart.
So will we be expecting a similar mechanism from you at some point in the future?
I can confidently say that I will never be making a mechanism like this for a pen. The $105,000 price tag, I understand exactly why they've done that. The amount of time and effort that must have gone into prototyping and designing this, it must have been astronomical. The only way to make your money back on this would be to charge ridiculous sums of money for it, because otherwise you can never make your money back on it. So yeah, I have no intention of ever designing something like this.
Now, for $105,000, I am a little disappointed that they decided to use a little spring clip within the mechanism there, similar to what you'd find holding a chronograph pusher in on a Seiko, as opposed to something a little more classy and robust.
There are a few things in there I would have made different design decisions on. Things like materials. It's an interesting mechanism, but it certainly doesn't have the look of a premium pen.
Yeah, I was genuinely curious what you had been referring to there on Twitter, because you were pretty ambiguous, and I was just like, what am I out of the loop on? And it turns out it was something that had crossed my radar 2 years ago.
Yeah, me too. I like seeing interesting things, but I like seeing interesting things in a timely manner as well.
Well, something interesting in a mildly more timely manner. Monochrome recently published a great interview with Kari Voutilainen. Did you manage to have a chance to read through that?
I've taken a glance through it. I saw you tweet about it the other day, and I haven't had a chance to actually read through the article. But taking a quick look, there's some, of course, there's some great photos. I always love reading about Kari and what he's doing, and I'm always interested in hearing what he has to say. But there are some really great photos in here, including some of workbenches, which I always love seeing, as well as someone working on a straight line engine engraving one of their dials.
Yeah. So what did you think of their straight line engine there?
Yeah, that's an interesting engine. I'm not 100% sure, but I think it is an early Neuweiler engine, so that would have been a Swiss-made engine. Most of the Neuweiler engines I've seen are a more modern design than this one, but it has cues and characteristics that are consistent with some of the Neuweilers that I've seen. So I suspect that's what it is. It's a horrible green. I think I would have repainted it, but it looks like a great engine. And the Neuweilers, if that is what it is, they're extremely well built.
And do there appear to be any modifications or upgrades that catch your eye?
Yeah, one of the upgrades that they've done, which is pretty common, a lot of us have done this. Well, two really. One is the microscope. So you can see Engine Turner is using a microscope to be able to see at high resolution what it is that they're doing, which when you're working on these watch dials, it's extremely important. Sometimes you'll have, 10 or 15 cuts per millimeter, and you want to be able to see exactly what it is that you're doing. And you might have to go back and recut an area, so you need to be able to make sure your cutter is going into exactly where it was. So that's one of the common upgrades that people are doing, and one of the reasons why the engine turning that we're doing today is superior to the engine turning that was being done 100 years ago during Fabergé's time. The other upgrade that's been done here is there's a stop on the tool itself, which uses the head of a micrometer. We've talked about using micrometers for measuring, and those are set up in sort of a C format where you've got the micrometer head and then you've got an anvil, and you put the part in between the two, and you measure the distance between the micrometer head and the anvil. In this case, they've just taken the micrometer head itself, and this way you can accurately set a stop against the machine so that the tool can only cut so deep. Which is extremely important when you're dealing with these very, very fine cuts. And in many cases, you're dealing with depths of cut that are maybe 0.1, 0.2 millimeters deep. and so it's very, very easy to cut too deep, and so these micrometer heads allow you to very accurately adjust to the maximum depth of cut that you can use.
They have long admired Kari's work, and it's just always appreciate whenever a new interview or tidbit of information comes out, because it always sheds a little bit of background on his history, his approach, and just what he values and his mindset when it comes to running a business as an independent watchmaker, which is no easy feat, as he alludes to there in the article. It's a huge amount of respect for him.
Yeah, it's always nice hearing from Kari. The other person I've been hearing a lot from recently is Peter Speak Marin. There have been a number of interviews with him lately, and as his project, the Naked Watchmaker project, has sort of gathered some steam, he's been doing a lot more press about it and doing a bunch of interviews. Some of them are. There've been a few podcast ones where the audio has been pretty marginal, but Peter is another guy who always has interesting things to say about the industry and what people are doing. So if you ever see interviews with him, they're worthwhile reading.
And from what I've gleaned from the things that Peter has shared, he seems to have suffered a little bit from the sort of pitfalls that Kari warns against in this particular interview. Now, another interesting independent watchmaker who recently took home a prize at the GPHG is Rexepi. And I worked my way through an article that was originally published in Albanian recently. And that was quite a piece to try and work through and understand, I suppose would be the correct way to frame it.
Yeah.
But I found that to be very enlightening as well, and just learning more about his background and the work and the sacrifice that he has poured into making it to where he has. And it can seem like an overnight success, but it really isn't. It's there's a lot of drudgery and ups and downs that come with being able to create these really works of art. And I know we both had nothing but high praise for the chronomètre contemporain that he debuted at SIHH earlier this year, and that recently took home the Men's Watch Prize at the GPHG, which is essentially the Academy Awards of watchmaking.
Yeah, that was one of the watches that I was really impressed with this year. I love the design. I love the style of what they're doing on the outside. And then you start looking at the movement itself, and the movement is a masterpiece in and of itself. So I have a huge amount of respect for what he's doing with his watch brand and the style that they've created.
It is truly one of the best balanced movements, architecturally speaking, that I've ever seen.
Absolutely.
And the finish is incredible as well.
I remember seeing photos of one of the early prototypes of his pieces, and the prototype was nicer than most companies are doing on their finished work. It was just incredible, and he was apologizing for the poor finish quality on this movement because it was a prototype, and yet it far exceeded what most people were doing.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, there were a few other watches in that that won awards this year around. I think some of them we've talked about before that we like. I know the Van Cleef and Arpels, the Ladies Planetarium. That was one that we mentioned earlier on in the year. That's an interesting design. I know it's a miniaturized version of the men's one that they did a few years ago. Anytime you add an astronomical complication to a watch, I'm always fascinated with it. I like the look of it and adding to it. The other one was the Nomos Tangent Neomatic. I'm a big fan of this watch. This is the one that has the date feature with the little red dots around the outside to tell you which day of the month it is. And this is a watch that I really like the design of. I love the Bauhaus inspired design that Nomos uses, and I love what they've done with this particular date feature. I find a lot of date complications are just not that attractive, but they've managed to make this one both attractive and user friendly, which often doesn't happen.
I'd argue it could be even more user friendly, but that's a topic for another time.
I suspect it could be, but I like what they've done. I think it's
Yes,
good.
I agree.
So many people are trying to do different things with day date complications, and often they're doing something different, but it's not legible, and it's, at the end of the day, this is supposed to be something that's actually usable, and when the user experience isn't great, it's I don't know. I'm not a fan of some of these complications just for complications' sake if they're not easily legible.
Now, one extremely complicated piece I think was worthy of the prize that was bestowed upon it was Grubel Forzy's Grand Sonnerie.
Yes, absolutely.
And just like Rexep's work, impeccably finished as well. And the only other sort of standout one, this is kind of a curious one for me, was the Audacity Prize that was given to Konstantin Chaikin for it, or Chaikin. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce his name correctly. That's his clown piece, or the Joker. And what I find somewhat interesting about that is something that would not have been mentioned at the show, but just a little bit of backstory there, as there is a young gentleman named Lee Yuen Rapiti who does the 1 hour watch on Instagram and all the other social media sites, and Twitter included. Constantine happens to follow him. And several years ago, he drew a watch that was effectively a happy face, but is more or less this piece that took home the Audacity Prize. And prior to the very first version of this that Constantine made, he had reached out and said to Lee that he quite enjoyed his drawings very much.
And then all of a
so
sudden it
he
becomes a reality.
a real watch. Yeah, exactly.
That's interesting.
And I know the two of them had a chance to chat a little bit in London this past year. So I think that Lee deserves an honorable mention here as well for that prize that Constantine took home.
Yeah, I do enjoy the whimsy of this. If you haven't seen it, there have been a few different versions of this watch. I think it was originally created for the One Watch auction a few years ago, and I know they did a very limited run of the Joker watch that they did, and I think they did there was a Halloween inspired one. So they've done a few versions sort of based on the same idea. But I do like the design. I find it amusing, and I like some of the reactions it's gotten, both positive and negative. I think it's a lot of fun. The Santa Fe Symposium is held annually in Albuquerque, New Mexico. It's the premier collaborative forum for jewelers and professionals in jewelry-related fields. Bench jewelers, manufacturers, lapidarists, metallurgists, casters, educators, and many more take part in this multifaceted event. The symposium was founded as a non-commercial, not-for-profit gathering for professionals willing to share their research, challenges, solutions, and innovations. By attending, you will come away with practical know-how you can put to use in your own work. Each year, 24 papers are presented across an exemplary range of jewelry-making endeavors. Attendees receive a copy of the proceedings book as well as a USB drive with the presentations. Attendees form new relationships, strengthen existing bonds, and build their professional networks with colleagues from around the world. The Santa Fe Symposium offers incredible benefits that last throughout the year and into the future, and the benefits grow stronger each year you attend. Longtime listeners of this show will be familiar with some of the fascinating places I've visited over the past year, including tours of Goldsmiths Company, Cookson's Gold, and Birmingham City University. Those visits are all thanks to the relationships I've built from attending the Santa Fe Symposium. The Santa Fe Symposium is one of the few must-attend events of the year for me, and I hope you join me in Albuquerque next year. The list of speakers for the 2019 symposium are on the site now. I'm looking forward to a number of papers, including Chris Plouffe and Phil Poirier talking about rose engines and ornamental lathes, as well as Callie Shevlin talking about enameling, and Frank Cooper talking about recreating a helm from the Staffordshire Hoard. Frank gave me a tour of the work he and his colleagues have done on this helm project, and you don't want to miss this paper. The 2019 Santa Fe Symposium will be held May 19th to the 22nd. Visit santafesymposium.org today for more information on the lineup of speakers and how to attend. Last episode, I highlighted the work of Anne-Marie Carey from Birmingham City University. This episode, I want to introduce you to the work of Anne Cahoon. As part of her day job as an instructor at the North Bennett Street School in Boston, Anne is exposed to plenty of discussion about the hows and whys of what we do as bench jewelers. It led her to writing 2 papers on various bench myths and to challenge some of the accepted wisdom that is passed on to each new generation of jeweler. Regardless of if you are an experienced bench jeweler or just getting started, her papers will give you insight into some of the fundamental techniques we rely on, such as sawing, filing, annealing, and soldering. You can find both of Anne's papers and explore hundreds more at santafesymposium.org.
I hear you've been having some issues with your lathe. What's been going on there?
Yeah, the Cromwell lathe that I've been using, we've spoken about that before. It's an antique lathe. It was built in the late 40s in Britain, and it was sort of the Rolls-Royce of lathes, if you will. In fact, Rolls-Royce themselves used the lathes on the shop floor to manufacture engines and parts for engines. And it has an intriguing electrical setup in it. It's using a complex drive mechanism called a Ward-Leonard drive system. It was invented in the late 1800s, and it allows variable speed control without the loss of torque, which is extremely difficult to do before you get into sort of modern electronics and modern electricity. Nowadays, with high-end equipment, we tend to use 3-phase power to create a setup where you can do speed control easily. With single-phase power, you can use a particular digital setup that allows you to do speed control. But back 100 years ago, or when this lathe was made sort of 70 years ago, the options for variable speed were not very great. So most lathes at the time used different pulleys to control the speed. And so you would have, let's say 5 different settings and then back gears. So you might have 10 different speed settings that you could use. This it's a fascinating system, and it is intriguing the way that it works. However, the downside of it is that the wiring in it is unbelievably complicated. It's a bit of a mess to follow what's going on and what's happening. There are, in fact, 3 different motors inside of the lathe. There's an AC motor that's hooked up to the mains, and when you power on the machine, it spins up, and it is directly connected to a DC motor. So it's spinning a DC motor, and when you spin a DC motor, it turns into a generator. And that generator is then supplying DC power to a third motor, a DC motor, which is what's hooked up to the spindle. Anyways, the long and short of it is that the generator is spinning up just fine, or I should say the mains motor is spinning up just fine and spinning the generator. But I wasn't getting any power into my drive motor, and I'm not sure if it's a problem somewhere along the chain that is, just meaning that it isn't the correct power getting to the drive motor, or if the drive motor itself is dead, because the drive motor and the generator are both original motors to that lathe. The mains motor isn't. It was replaced when the lathe was shipped over here to Canada. This particular one started its life here in Canada in the NRC labs here in Ottawa. And they put a motor that was set up for our power. And so it's a regular single-phase 220 motor in there. The other motors are original to the lathe, and something along the line has died. So I've needed to come up with a solution to repair that. And after spending a couple of hours sort of troubleshooting it to see if I could figure out what's going on, I decided to remove the original drive motor and replace it with a more modern motor. I'm in the process of mounting a modern 220 3-phase motor to it, and I'm then hooking it up to a digital variable frequency drive that will allow me to control the speed through a little box that's on my lathe. So I'm keeping all the original components in case whomever gets it afterwards wants to troubleshoot it and get it back into running as it was originally. But right now I'm using it as a production lathe, and I can't afford to spend hours trying to troubleshoot this lathe every time something goes wrong with it.
So in the original setup, was it the three-phase motor or the AC motor that was where the speed was controlled from, or are you adding an additional frequency control on top of the speed control that would basically control the speed of the final DC motor that's turning the spindle?
The speed control was being done directly on the drive motor. So the mains motor was always spinning at the same speed. It was a 3600 RPM motor, so it was always spinning at that speed and therefore driving the generator at that speed. So it was always generating the same amount of power. And then there's a potentiometer that is in line between the generator and the drive motor, which was adjusting the voltage that was going to the drive motor and adjusting the speed through that potentiometer. It's an ingenious setup, and it really is remarkable what they were able to do with very primitive electronics compared to what we have, or electrics, I should say. It's not even electronics. There's certainly nothing electronic in this. It's it predates all of that. So I think the first Ward Leonard drive system was used for a World's Fair. It was being used to power the motors for the moving sidewalks in the World's Fair to move people around, and so they could adjust the speed of it and not lose power or not lose torque in the motor.
So what is the purpose of the VFD then, or the variable frequency drive that you've added?
In my case, I don't have three-phase power in my shop. Unfortunately, three-phase power is not very common in North America anymore outside of industrial settings. So in my case, if I wanted to get three-phase power into the shop, it would probably cost me, $1 million or something like that.
It's a little out of budget.
Yeah, unfortunately, my budget doesn't quite reach out to having three-phase power delivered from the road, because it's around 7 kilometers away is the sort of the closest three-phase power to where I am. So I'd have to pay Hydro One to drag that three-phase power to my shop, and that's just not going to happen. So in my case, I need to take single-phase power that I'm getting from the wall and convert it into three-phase power for this motor. These digital VFDs are a relatively inexpensive way of converting that single-phase power, generating the other two legs that it needs to be able to control the motor and power it up. And then also has some other advantages. In my case, I've got a little remote that's wired into the VFD, so I can mount the VFD box itself, which isn't small. I don't want to mount that, sort of in front of where I am working and whatnot. And so it has a little remote panel that you can then mount somewhere else, and it's just got a cable that goes back down to the main box. And in there, I can do things like I can see what speed what RPM the motor is spinning at. I can adjust it easily. There's little buttons that I can use for adjusting it, or if I need to reverse the motor, it's very simple. I can just reverse it with the press of a button. So that's quite nice. And because it's a digital setup, I can also program in the ratio between the speed of the motor versus the speed of the spindle, because in my case, it isn't 1-to-1. The speed of the motor maxes out at 3600 RPM, but the spindle itself will go up to 5000. So I can convert that, speed and put the ratio in. And so when I see the speed on my little controller, it's the actual speed of the spindle versus the speed of the motor. Little things like that make it nice to work with, and it's sort of modernizing this machine and making it a little bit more useful and a little bit more reliable for me.
So have you had one of your backups to rely on or fill the void for you while you work at this, or has this just been your focus for the last little bit, getting this back up and running?
I do have a few other lathes. Well, as we've talked about before, I have more than a few other lathes. Unfortunately, this is the most convenient one to do work on, let's say, my watch case. So my watch case I haven't been working on very much the last little while because this lathe has been down. And I have a watchmaking lathe in my watch studio that is smaller. It's a Derbyshire watchmaking lathe, and it's a great little lathe, but right now it's really configured for doing small detailed work. So I have tiny collets that are designed for doing detailed work on, let's say, a staff or something like that. And one of the things I need to do is make some larger step collets for it that can support my watch cases. And that way I can actually turn the watch cases as well on there and have it as a backup. The other lathe that's up and running most of the time is my South Bend lathe, but that's a big 16-inch lathe. And it's not at all appropriate for doing this kind of small work on it. It doesn't spin fast enough. And frankly, I'm not sure that I would want that thing spinning at the sort of speed that's necessary for this detailed work. I think the chuck that's on there now weighs around 45 pounds. And, spinning that at 5,000 RPM would be a little bit terrifying. So that lathe doesn't do the fine detailed work. I generally use that lathe for making tooling and parts for other machines just because it is so big.
I'm sure you could chew up metal pretty quick with that.
Yeah, you can do some terrifying things to a piece of metal with that lathe. It just doesn't care. It doesn't stop. If you want to take a half-inch cut in a piece of steel, it will just chug away and keep chewing through it. It's a pretty impressive machine.
Well, somewhat tangential to this subject. Back in episode 21, when you first admitted your lathe addiction publicly, we touched on the fact that the definition of a kilogram was on the brink of being changed. And by the time that this episode goes live, that will indeed have come to pass. So that the kilogram as we know it is no more. In fact, it's more precise.
Yeah, on the 16th of November, the Grande K is being retired as the definition of the kilogram, and it's now being tied to Planck's constant. And so that piece of platinum that's sitting in a vault in Paris is no longer going to be exactly 1 kilogram. It will be very, very close to a kilogram, but it will no longer be the definition of a kilogram. I'm excited to see this. I think there's 4 or 5 other units that are changing as well because they are in some way or another tied to the definition of a kilogram. So there are a few other base SI units that need to change, and in most cases very, very slightly. Like there's no real world impact on these changes. So there's a bunch of changes happening in the metrology world over the next couple of days.
So we won't go into too much detail on those changes here, as it's something we've touched on quite a bit in previous episodes already, but we will link to a new video from Derek Mueller over at Veritasium that walks through the changes that are taking place to the kilogram. Now, the whole reason that we first started talking about SI units and the kilogram was because of Simon Winchester's The Perfectionists. And another aspect of that book that has been plaguing me recently is optics and glass and lenses. And I have recently been tasked with doing some conservation work on a historically significant piece. And as a part of that conservation, I am also needing to document all the various steps along the way. And I busted out my trusty digital SLR and a macro lens that I inherited from my brother-in-law, and was been trying quite futilely to get some good images of the components close up to a level of quality that I would like them to be. I've actually happened to, or found myself in the position that I've fallen back on using my iPhone 10 for a lot of the shots, just because I find I'm getting much cleaner shots using the iPhone, and that's probably due to all of the computational imaging that's going on there in the background and heavily leveraging the processor. But I'm just curious, what's your setup for taking product shots of your pens and whatnot?
There's a few things that I do. So my primary camera is a Nikon D810. That's what I've been shooting with for the last few years. And I use 2 different macro lenses for it. One is a 60 millimeter macro lens, and the other is a 105 millimeter macro lens. Those have done very well for me over the last couple of years. One of the key things that I do when I'm taking product photos is that I use a technique called focus stacking. it's a technique that allows me to take multiple photos at different focus points and then combine them so that all of the out of focus parts get deleted and only the in focus parts are kept. And it allows me to photograph large things and keep everything in focus, which would be challenging to do with the setup that I've got otherwise. That's been my primary setup for doing photography. I know a number of people have been using their iPhones for shooting detailed watch photos. I know one of the popular setups right now is using the loop system. It's a large jeweler's loop or watchmaker's loop that's been designed for looking at watches in detail and being able to get a lot of great light through it and a lot of really great images out of it. And they've also made a case that allows you to snap one of these loops onto the back of your iPhone. And I've seen some amazing photos and videos coming out of that.
Yeah, I have a small macro lens that I often use with my phone that I've had for years and years. Not quite as fancy as the loop system, but it does the job quite well. The issue that I've run into with the macro lens that I have is like a halo effect. Because focus stacking is something I've done before and I am familiar with and got workflows in Photoshop to be able to do that. And Affinity Photo for the iPad, which we've mentioned in the past, actually makes it really simple as well to do focus stacking. And like at that price point too, it's a no-brainer to pick that app up. So that's all great, but I'm guessing it's some issue somewhere in the lens, or maybe something's just not clean. I don't know what's transpired, but I get like almost a hazy blue halo over some of the shinier parts.
Yeah, I think what you're probably getting is chromatic aberration. And this is a problem with lower quality lenses in particular, where you end up with a bit of a fringe in different colors depending on how it's sort of presents itself. I know certainly lower quality lenses for digital SLRs, you'll see that a lot in low quality cameras and cheap cell phones. You'll see the chromatic aberration. Sometimes it's sort of a purplish pink hue that you get around things. Sometimes it's blue, green. So I suspect you may be getting some chromatic aberration, and that's coming from the lens and probably the low quality of it. You may not have noticed it before now, just because the cameras in these iPhones have gotten so good that you may have sort of exceeded the optical limits of the lens that you've got.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly what I figured the issue at play is, because it's a lens that's probably 35, 40 years old.
Right.
Yes, I've thought about using my newer 50 millimeter lens with a tube in between it and the camera body to turn it into a macro lens. But I'd then lose out on any sort of auto focusing and whatnot. So a little more manual work on my end, but it would be necessary anyway to do the focus stacking. But one little trick too that helps there is something that's simply called the lens twist trick. So opening the aperture wide up and then twisting away from the camera body so that the aperture is left wide open. And that's something you can do when, say, taking time lapse of photos, so it prevents any sort of flickering that could occur there. But then removing it from the camera body and tossing some tubes in the middle. So I may try that approach, but I'm actually pretty satisfied with what I've been able to pull off with the iPhone. And the client that I'm doing this for is actually more than impressed with what I've been able to do with the iPhone. I ideally would like to have the slightly higher resolution that I can pull from the SLR. But the iPhone is doing the trick, and it is possible to shoot RAW on the iPhone now too, using third-party apps. So
absolutely,
certainly, it's impressive what these little cameras can pull off. Obviously, not as great as true high-grade professional gear and what that might be able to do, but to think that this is a complete camera and lens, multi-lens system that is mere millimeters thick is mind-boggling.
Yeah, and as we've mentioned before, I've stopped carrying my DSLR a lot of times unless I know that I want to shoot some specific photos that on a holiday or something like that. I'm often leaving my DSLR at home because the iPhone has just gotten so good. Now, the other option that I've got available to me here, if the macro lens can't handle the magnification that I need, my microscope also has an option to mount a camera onto it. It's a trinocular microscope, and the third tube allows me to mount I think it's a C-mount lens. So there's an adapter out there that I can mount my Nikon camera onto it, and the microscope effectively becomes the camera lens for my camera. So that allows me to shoot still and video through that, and I can get anywhere. In my case, I can get anywhere from 7 to 45x magnification out of it, just by adding my camera to the top of my microscope.
And you recently relaunched your YouTube channel.
Well, I'm starting to. It's I'm starting to try and get some content, some new content up there. There's a single video up there that's been there for 3 years now, I guess, my mechanical apprentice video, and I'm nearly finished editing the video that I'm making from my Santa Fe Symposium talk earlier in the year. I recorded the audio while I was giving the talk, and I'm inserting the slides as well as the video from the talk into a video. It's going to be probably 45 or 50 minutes long, but for those who want to go back and see my Santa Fe talk, that hopefully will be up in the next week or so and visible. But yeah, on top of that, I am also starting to work towards recording and filming the things that I do in the shop. So all of the things that I do, not just watch related things, but also some of the machining that I do and the jewelry work that I do. So that's going to be a focus of the next few months in particular, trying to get some new videos put up and recorded for that.
So you picked up any new gear to be filming all this footage this past year?
I've been struggling a little bit because I've been using my D810 to shoot video with, and Nikon is never given a lot of control over what's going on the video side. Their video setup is not very good. I know there was a huge revolution thanks to the Canon 5D Mark II a few years ago, probably more than a few years ago at this point, and it was sort of the first digital SLR that had decent video capabilities in it. And unfortunately, while Nikon has sort of followed suit to some degree and you can record video on it, it's not an ideal setup for it. So I've been trying to decide if I wanted to continue pursuing using a digital SLR for it or not. One of the other limits of my D810 is that it records in 1080p, and I wanted to start filming everything in 4K so that I can sort of start from a higher quality video than what most people are doing. So in my case, I'm now starting to look at the brand new Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K. That name is horrible. Companies, you need to start thinking of better.
But the camera is incredible.
The camera is incredible, but the name is horrible. Your marketing departments really need to come up with better names for these things. The Blackmagic camera is a remarkable camera. It's relatively inexpensive as these things go. In fact, I had looked at getting a D850 from Nikon because it does 4K video, and this Blackmagic 4K pocket camera, it's less than half the price of buying a new D850, and frankly is significantly better at filming. That's all that it's geared for. It's designed specifically for that. The ergonomics are designed for it. All the features are designed for it. So that's what I'm currently in the process of trying to acquire and create a new setup in my shop so that I can easily record 4K footage of what I'm doing and then start putting that together into hopefully interesting videos that people will enjoy.
Yeah, compared to the 810, it is remarkable as well that the iPhones and the iPads now can record in 4K. And I shouldn't even say now. They've been able to record 4K video for a number of years, which is incredibly impressive, once again, for such a small sensor and lens system.
And with the new iPhone XS that's been released back in September, so a few months ago now, the 4K filming in it is impressive. If you're shooting in 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second, what Apple does is they actually film at 60 frames a second, and every second frame is shot at either higher or lower exposure. and they can then create a high dynamic range video out of it, which is impressive. The fact that they're able to do this on the fly, they've got enough computing power to be able to basically film twice as many frames as you actually need, and then stick them together in a way that you get a better dynamic range. I've been shooting a couple of videos with the new camera, the new phone, and a couple of photos as well. But the videos in particular, the quality of video that you're getting out of it, and particularly in situations where you've got these high dynamic range setups, where you've got maybe something very bright behind your subject, it's amazing the quality of video that you're getting out of these iPhones now. So the iPhone is going to be probably the backup camera to the Blackmagic camera in terms of getting some shots, because there are times where just having a small portable camera like that is actually convenient and can get better shots than what the larger camera can do.
It's just handy for picking up a little bit of B-roll here and there.
Absolutely.
Now, do you have a mount for your phone to set it up on a tripod?
I do have a mount. I have a Glyph mount. This was a Kickstarter project that came out a few years ago, and they've released a couple of different versions of it. I have the most recent one that I use with my phone, and it's great. It's got a 1/4-20 threaded hole on it so that it's easy to mount on various things. So I can put it on a tripod or a monopod or something like that. I also use the Magic Arms from Manfrotto, which is a great articulated arm that's very easy to lock in place. So I can use that for putting my cameras exactly where I need. And then I've also used the gimbal from DJI, the Osmo Mobile, for mounting my camera in, or I should say for mounting my phone in. And that allows me to get some very good footage while I'm moving without it bumping around and looking really awkward. So yeah, there's a few options out there for mounting the phone and getting a good stable shot out of it, and turning it into a very professional looking image. So it's certainly a lot of flexibility with it.
Do you use Osmo's app then when you use the gimbal, or do you film in just the regular Apple camera or a different app altogether?
I have been using the DJI app, although I'm not particularly happy with it. I'm thinking about using Filmic Pro for the control of it, because Filmic Pro has a lot of advanced options that the native app doesn't have, and the certainly the DJI one doesn't have. But the problem is the only app at this point, I believe, that's doing the HDR video through the multiple frame exposure thing is the actual native Apple video app. So that sort of keeps me going back to that app, just because it's right now it's computationally it's the most advanced of the apps that's available to me on the phone.
Mm-hmm. But I guess you miss it on the focus point type features from the native, or native I guess is the wrong word, from DJI's app, which is kind of unfortunate, but I suppose you're not in any circumstances where you're relying on that.
No, those features are pretty neat, and they're certainly useful. It has a subject tracking feature, so you can click on or surround an object, like let's say somebody's head, and the gimbal will automatically track that person so that they always stay in frame. And when that's set up properly, it's amazing how well it works.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not in a situation really where I'm using that kind of feature, so that's less of a concern for me.
I found it a little clunky trying to use the gimbal with just the regular camera app, but it certainly makes the video far more stable. But it is a little trickier for tracking along with a subject if you're doing something particularly active.
Yeah, I was shooting some video when I was in Japan last year. I was walking through a park in Kyoto, and I didn't have a gimbal at the time, and I'd been waffling back and forth whether I wanted to buy one, and I should have bought one before I went there, because it's the quality of video that you get with a gimbal versus just sort of handheld is dramatically different. So that's I'm actually considering getting a gimbal that I'll be able to use my Blackmagic camera on as well, so that when I am out and I'm shooting, I'll be able to get better quality footage than what I'd be able to get just doing a handheld. So we'll see. I haven't decided yet whether I'm going to go that route or not, but it certainly makes a big difference if you can use a gimbal.
A few more years, maybe you'll have half a dozen drones in your workshop following you around too.
I'm not sure that I could deal with the noise that they put out. I find drones fascinating, but the noise that comes out of them is ridiculous.
So you've picked up the 10s. Have you picked up the Series 4 Apple Watch as well? Or are you holding off on that one?
No, I haven't picked that up yet. I think I'm going to get one. I think I am actually going to get one of the aluminum ones. I was worried before about destroying the watch in the shop, and I think I've just got to get over it, because if I get the aluminum one, the sport one, I can basically destroy that thing once a year and replace it every year and still spend less money than what I was going to on the stainless steel version.
And the price is appreciably more here in Canada than it is down stateside.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So yeah, so I think I'm going to get the Series 4, get the LTE in it, and that'll also help me sort of unplug from my phone a little bit.
And what do you think of the new iPads?
The new iPads are impressive, and I am looking forward to getting one. Yes, I will be definitely getting one. I like what they've done with the redesign. I love the fact that the larger one, the 12.9-inch iPad Pro, they've shrunk the physical size of the device by a fair bit. And I think I'm probably going to go back to a 12.9-inch iPad Pro. I did have one years ago, and I found it a bit too big and a bit too clumsy, but this new one is basically the size of an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. So it's become a more reasonable size with the same size screen. So I think I'm going to do that. I'm a little disappointed that the old pencil isn't compatible with the new one. However, I am very impressed with what they've done with the new pencil in terms of the redesign. So, I'm going to get a new pencil, because I do use mine enough that I'll need that. But yeah, the new iPad Pros, I love the design, especially the exterior design. They've gone back to a sort of a square design, reminiscent of the iPhone 4 and the iPhone 5 series of phones, and I hope that this is foreshadowing what they're going to do with the iPhone in the near future, because I love the square shape. I love the design that they've moved towards with these.
Yeah, my hands-on time with it, I actually found it a little bit too square. I would have appreciated a small taper, but then that throws off the charging of the number 2 pencil, which I agree with you is leaps and bounds better than their original Apple Pencil. So really impressed with the changes there. But I thought I would want to get the new iPad, but I'm going to hold off after having a bit of hands-on time with it. It's not for me just yet. And we are actually, we no longer have a 12.9 in the house. We no longer have a pencil in the house.
Oh, really?
Because I'm just not using it enough to justify it. So the Air 2, oddly enough, is the iPad I use the most around the house, and tends to be the use cases that, suits the use cases that I have for it best. Now, there is a portion of me that really wants to be someone who makes solid use of the pencil and what the iPad Pro has to offer. But in reality and in practice, it's just not quite there for me yet. Now, perhaps that will change with the imminent release of real Photoshop on the iPad coming up in 2019. But until that time, and until I've had a chance to give that a whirl, I'm not going to bite the bullet just yet.
Yeah, I have to say the biggest limitation of these devices at this point is not the hardware. The hardware is unbelievable. And if you watch the keynote, they talk about how much faster the iPad Pro is now than, I think they said, like 90% of the mobile computers that are out there on the market now, including their own. I mean, when you look at the speed tests on these new iPad Pros, they outperform most of the notebook computers that are out there on the market now. So at this point, it's no longer a limitation of the hardware, and frankly, the screens on them are gorgeous. So that hasn't been a problem.
Minus some fingerprint issues.
Yeah, the fingerprints get a little bit annoying, but you can deal with that. For me, my biggest complaint about these devices is the lack of some applications. Obviously, Photoshop, Adobe has announced that they're bringing out a full version of Photoshop for it. And from all accounts, people who've been using the beta, it is extremely impressive on these devices. So if you're a heavy Photoshop user, that's something to look forward to. I'm not a big Photoshop user. I tend to use Affinity Photo instead, both on my Mac and on my iPad, although these days it's almost exclusively on my iPad, and I'm a big fan of that. It's also significantly less expensive than Photoshop and has things like the focus stacking option that I use. So that tends to be my go-to for that. But I'm incredibly frustrated with Apple and the fact that their Pro apps aren't available for the iPad. For their video editing app, Final Cut Pro, and their audio editing app, Logic Pro. I use both of those on a regular basis for editing video for the YouTube channel, also for editing this podcast. I use Logic for doing that. And it's frustrating to me that they're not available on the iPad because there's no good reason why the iPad could not handle the same kind of work that my 15-inch MacBook Pro is doing. There's no reason why I shouldn't be able to edit 4K video on my iPad or edit this podcast on my iPad. And right now, the fact that I have to bring my MacBook Pro along with me, if I go overseas or whatever for 3 weeks, I need to be able to edit the episode that we've recorded. And the fact that I have to bring my MacBook Pro along to do that is incredibly frustrating.
So I don't know if you saw the MKBHD video recently with the magnetic film that he ran over the back of the iPad. Yeah. Did you also notice that the way that he had the iPad he was handling back and forth position was over the ledge? That was just simply so he could pick it up, because it's almost impossible to pick up a naked iPad off a table with one hand.
Yeah, that is frustrating. When you have the square sides on a device that large. I can palm the 10.5 inch one and pick it up one handed just by palming it, but the 12.9 I can't do that. So even with the reduced size that it has now, so that'll be a little bit frustrating. But I'm a fan of the new design. One of the things that I like about it is I find the curved edges are too slippery, and that's less of an issue on an iPad. But I find, especially on the phone, one of the reasons why I use a case nowadays is with those rounded sides. You can't sort of lock the phone into your hand. You can't sort of take the sharp corner and sort of rest it up against your hand and assume that it's going to stay there. I just find it too slippery. So that's why I'm hoping that design language comes back to the phone and we start seeing a square shape and a sort of a more square design.
Yeah, that little bit of grip that an edge like that gives you is one of the other nice features of the profile on the Microsoft Surface tablets. I would appreciate just a very slight chamfer or tilt on the edge. It doesn't have to be extreme, but the flat sides just make it a little hard to handle.
I am interested in seeing what other people do with keyboards and things like that. I have been missing my keyboard. I had a keyboard for one of my older iPads, and I used it a lot. And I hadn't found one for this 10.5-inch iPad that I was happy with. And I'm not particularly impressed with the Apple case that has the keyboard built into it. I don't particularly like that style of keyboard. But I know there's a few companies out there. Bridge, I think, is one of them that has made some interesting keyboards over the last couple of years. I'm looking forward to seeing what they do with their keyboard for this new generation of iPad. Because when I am on the road, it is kind of nice to be able to have a keyboard on there that I can type on and I can do some work. That certainly makes things a little bit easier. So between adding a keyboard to it, the new pencil, and hopefully soon Pro apps from Apple, that would be really nice. And I hope we don't have to wait until WWDC to see something like that come out, or iOS 13. I hope that Apple decides to release it sooner than that, because I will gladly pay to have both of those on my iPad if it means that I can avoid bringing my MacBook with me when I'm on holiday.
Well, hopefully 2019 is the year of Pro apps for the iPad.
That'd be nice to see. At this point, the hardware's certainly there.
Now, I am impressed that you can palm a 10.5-inch iPad. I'm sitting here with a 9.7, and I cannot palm it for the life.
Yeah, but that 9.7 has a larger bezel on it than my 10.5.
Does it
yeah,
really?
It
does. By how much? Not by much.
Got big hands, John. I've told you this before. I've got large hands.
You know what they say about guys with big hands?
We need big pens.
Exactly. And big mittens. Big, big mittens. It is cold out there.
Oh, John, don't get me started about that. This is the time of year when I'm always trying to figure out how to live somewhere warmer. So if you're interested in being a patron of a jeweler / watchmaker / machinist, and you're interested in putting me up in a warm spot in the world, you're welcome to get in touch. info@silverhandstudios.com, and I would happily talk to you about relocating to somewhere warm where I can do my work and not freeze.
Well, I'm sure the Santa Fe Symposium in May will be a welcome change in weather for you. And our thanks again to the Santa Fe Symposium for sponsoring this episode.
Thanks for listening to Off Hours. You can find detailed show notes at offhours.show. If you'd like to keep up to date with the show, follow us on Twitter @offhours. John can be found on Twitter @UnderTheLoop, and Chris can be found on Twitter and Instagram @silver_hand.